There ain't no difference between a flying saucer and a time.
And I'm thinking as I'm sitting here now, well, maybe this is my big break. This is my big chance.
The 1980s were a golden age of big hair, big budgets, and even bigger expectations. Hollywood was cranking out blockbusters faster than you could say Spielberg. But in between the hits, E.T., Top Gun,
So you're the one.
Yes, ma'am.
Back to the Future,
Hey, McFly, you bojo! Those bars don't work on water! Unless you...
there was a weirder, riskier side of the decade nobody likes to talk about. This is the story of the movies that crashed and burned before rising from the ashes. The ones studios didn't know how to market, critics didn't know how to review, and audiences didn't know how to watch. They flopped hard, sometimes embarrassingly so. Yet somehow, years later, these same misfires found their fans. Midnight screenings, bootleg VHS tapes, and devoted nerds turned them into cult classics. From neon-drenched rock operas to punk-fueled alien comedies, here are the 80s Hollywood flops that refused to stay buried. Walter Hill had just scored big with 48 Hours, so Universal basically told him to go nuts. He came back with this offbeat idea called Streets of Fire, mixing old-school greaser looks and loud rock anthems. Michael Pare showed up brooding as the lead, Diane Lane played a singer who got snatched, and Willem Dafoe strutted around in leather suspenders like some cartoon villain. The studio completely panicked trying to market it. Was it an action flick, a rock opera, a love story? They slapped together promos that made zero sense. No big stars, no clear angle, just confusion. Audiences dipped out fast. Critics called it pretty, but empty. The budget was huge, and it didn't even break even. What was supposed to launch a whole series just fizzled. Funny enough, later on, fans latched on to all the stuff that flopped. The bold style, the wild soundtrack, the fact it felt like nothing else. Next, Big Trouble in Little China. John Carpenter had already cranked out Halloween, The Thing, and Escape from New York, so he felt like switching lanes. He cooked up this bonkers mashup about kung fu and magic in San Francisco's Chinatown, where Kurt Russell played Jack Burton, a trucker who thought he was the star, but mostly bumbled around like a clueless extra. Picture an old adventure serial mixed with 80s silliness. Wizards throwing neon lightning, martial artists flying around, and Kurt swaggering like a low-budget cowboy. It was meant to poke fun at macho action stories, flipping things so the so-called hero barely helped while his Chinese crew did everything important. 20th Century Fox had no clue what to do with it. They freaked out and rushed it into theaters trying to beat Eddie Murphy's movie. It ended up buried under hits like Top Gun and Ferris Bueller. People were puzzled, critics argued, and the box office flopped. Years later, everyone realized it was actually genius. Next, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai.
Buckaroo, President's on line 1, calling about is everything okay with the alien spacecraft and Planet 10, or should he...
Director W.D. Richter and writer Earl MacRouch decided to throw every wild idea into one movie. They made this dead serious sci-fi story that felt like you just crashed into some comic book saga halfway through. Buckaroo Banzai was a brain surgeon, rock star, physics genius, and dimension-hopping hero all at once. Peter Weller, way before RoboCop fame, played Buckaroo, backed by future big names like Jeff Goldblum, John Lithgow, Ellen Barkin, and Christopher Lloyd. The story was pure chaos. Buckaroo and his squad, the Hong Kong Cavaliers, battled creepy aliens from the 8th dimension, while John Lithgow hammed it up as a totally unhinged villain. No one bothered to explain anything, so you either kept up or bailed. Audiences were baffled, and MGM's marketing team basically shrugged. The trailers looked like a bad knockoff, and nobody cared that the cast was stacked. It tanked fast, taking the planned sequel with it. Years later, nerds finally claimed it as their own weird treasure. Next, Repo Man.
There ain't no difference between a flying saucer and a time machine.
Director Alex Cox basically mashed together LA punk chaos, repo jobs, aliens, and government weirdness into one messy fever dream. Emilio Estevez played Otto, a punk kid who got roped into Repo Life by Harry Dean Stanton's crusty old pro. The story spun around a beat-up Chevy Malibu, hiding something glowing in the trunk. Maybe aliens, maybe just radioactive junk. It was like someone dared Alex to cram every satirical swipe at Reagan-era America into one movie. Bland brands labeled beer and food, non-stop punk anthems from Black Flag and Iggy Pop, and a total refusal to wrap things up neatly. Nobody at Universal knew who would even watch this. Emilio was barely known. Harry was respected, but not famous. And the whole thing seemed too strange to sell. They threw it into a few theaters with zero hype. Audiences missed it completely until VHS and midnight shows turned it into an underground legend. Eventually, everyone realized Alex had made something unforgettable. Next Manhunter.
I don't tear out the articles. I wouldn't want them to think I was dwelling on anything morbid.
Director Michael Mann, the guy behind Miami Vice, decided to tackle Thomas Harris's Red Dragon before anyone cared about Hannibal Lecter. The studio panicked about the title sounding too much like Kung Fu and slapped on Manhunter instead. William Peterson, way before CSI fame, played Will Graham, an FBI profiler so good at crawling into killers' heads, he nearly cracked himself. Tom Noonan creeped everyone out as the Tooth Fairy, and Brian Cox was the first actor to bring Hannibal to life, though here he was, called Lecter. Michael went all in on style, sharp visuals, and an icy electronic score that made it feel more like an art project than a crime thriller. Nobody knew what to do with it. The studio was small and broke, and Silence of the Lambs hadn't happened yet to hype up the Hannibal fandom. Audiences shrugged. Critics were split. Some loved the slick look, others called it dull. Years later, after Lecter blew up, people realized Michael had set the blueprint. Next, the king of comedy.
And I'm thinking as I'm sitting here now, well, maybe this is my big break. This is my big chance.
After Raging Bull, everyone figured Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro would keep cranking out gritty hits. Instead, they flipped the script and made a dark, awkward story about chasing fame. Robert signed on as Rupert Pupkin, a wannabe comedian so lost in his own hype, he started stalking a talk show host. The king of comedy followed Rupert as he crashed Jerry Lewis's life, rehearsed fake interviews with cardboard cutouts, and finally kidnapped him to force a TV spot. Martin shot the whole thing like an uncomfortable joke that never ended. There was no relief, just pure, secondhand embarrassment. Fans who loved Robert as a tough guy couldn't handle him playing a needy mess. The studio wanted another Taxi Driver, not some cold anti-comedy. Marketing tried to spin it as a regular satire, and people were annoyed when it turned out so bleak. It bombed hard. Later, directors like Todd Phillips called it a masterpiece. Back then, it was just too raw and too weird for anyone to get behind. Next, Near Dark.
Finger licking good.
Director Catherine Bigelow, way before the Hurt Locker fame, decided to smash up a Western with a vampire story just because she could. At the time, everyone was still stuck on slasher flicks, and nobody thought bloodsuckers were cool anymore. Near Dark followed Caleb, this regular guy who got bit by a drifter played by Jenny Wright and got dragged into a bunch of night-crawling vampires living like dusty outlaws. Catherine shot it like some fever dream, with brutal fights and zero humor. The soundtrack by Tangerine Dream only made it feel more offbeat. Lance Henriksen and Bill Paxton killed it on screen, but neither could sell tickets. De Laurentiis Entertainment Group barely even tried to promote it. No big posters, no hype. Fans who wanted goofy horror weren't signing up for something this grim. It flopped hard, but over time, Near Dark turned into a must-watch for horror nerds. Back then, though, it was just too out there to click with audiences. Next, Heathers.
You look like hell. Yeah, I just got back.
Writer Daniel Waters basically wanted to torch every cute high school movie people loved, so he cooked up Heathers, a pitch-black comedy where popularity turned deadly and nobody cared about happy endings. Michael Lehman shot it like a warped cartoon full of sarcasm and mean streaks. Winona Ryder played Veronica, a smart kid who joined the Heathers, the most ruthless clique in school. She linked up with JD, played by Christian Slater doing his best Jack Nicholson, and together they started knocking off the cool kids and pretending it was all tragic accidents. The script was full of savage one-liners that made it clear this wasn't some harmless teen flick. But teenage suicide as a punchline? Audiences were horrified. Winona was just getting noticed, and Christian wasn't famous yet. New World Pictures had no clue how to sell it, so it barely hit theaters. Once it landed on VHS, though, teens passed it around like contraband. Over time, Heathers became the blueprint for every dark high school movie that followed. Next, The Blob. The first Blob was this goofy old flick with Steve McQueen running from a giant wad of pink slime. So when horror remakes were suddenly cool, TriStar figured why not drag it back and make it gross. Chuck Russell, fresh off A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, jumped in with Frank Darabont, who'd later blow up with The Shawshank Redemption. They turned it into a mean little monster movie. A meteor crash let loose this acidic blob that sprinted after people, melted faces, and sucked bodies down drains. Kevin Dillon and Shawnee Smith played teens trying to survive, but nobody was really there for the acting. The effects were next-level disgusting in the best way. Problem was, everyone thought remaking The Blob sounded corny. Plus, horror fans were already tired after a bunch of slasher sequels clogging theaters. The marketing pushed the gore so hard that people expected cheap junk. It flopped, but horror nerds eventually claimed it as a secret masterpiece. Next, Blowout. Brian De Palma had just nailed it with Dressed to Kill and was itching to go bigger. He loved movies where artists stumbled into crimes, so he cooked up Blowout, a mashup of murder mystery, conspiracy thriller, and Hollywood takedown. John Travolta played Jack Terry, a sound guy for cheap horror flicks who accidentally recorded a car crash. When he listened back, he caught what sounded like a gunshot right before impact. From there, he spiraled into obsession, trying to figure out if someone got whacked. Nancy Allen played the woman he saved, while John Lithgow creeped everyone out as the psycho hitman. People wanted feel-good John from Grease, not this dark, paranoid story. Plus, the theaters were packed with big escapist hits, and no one was lining up for something this bleak. It tanked hard, and Brian felt crushed since he'd poured everything into it. Years later, directors like Quentin Tarantino called it a masterpiece. Back then, it was just too heavy for most people.